Okay, hello everybody. I'm going to get us started if that's okay. Okay, so Emma and Hannah and Ben, are you around? Hello. Right, sorry, bear with me. Okay, right, let's get started. So hello everyone, welcome. Just want to start by introducing myself. So my name's Will, I'm a clinical psychologist up in Manchester. Work part-time at Lancaster, part-time at Salford Hospital. So part of what I'm here to do today is kind of hopefully help with the introduction and the hosting, and I'll be talking a bit later on. I just want to introduce my three esteemed co-facilitators for the day. Do you want to introduce yourself, guys?
Yeah, I'll go. So my name is Ben Campbell. I'm a clinical psychologist. I work in an oncology service in Liverpool. That's it.
My name's Emma Fowler. I'm a final year trainee at Lancaster and I'm on placement in a later life service, community service in Manchester.
I'm Hannah Richardson, or Hughes as it probably comes up on my Teams account. I'm a first year trainee clinical psychologist at Lancaster.
Well, thanks, guys. So what we're hoping to do today is talk a bit about being working class in clinical psychology. Hopefully you guys, if you've made it this far, you've seen some of the tweets and discussions that have been going on, which hopefully gives you a bit of a sense as to what we're here to think about. What I thought I'd start off by doing is just talking a little bit about what we were hoping to get out of today, what we're hoping to offer. So I've got some notes in front of me, so if I'm looking back to my other screen, apologies. So basically, these webinars, the idea is that we're going to try and do one of these every month. So this is the first one. It's a bit of a trial run to see how we get on. But we're hoping to do something a bit similar. Might tweak the format a bit, but we're hoping to do something a bit similar going forwards every month. And we hope that this will provide a space to think about the challenges and the positive experiences that people have from people who identify as being from a working class background who have gone on to work in clinical psychology. So our aim with these webinars is to just start a conversation, really. We hope that by thinking about how being working class has affected our journey into the profession, we hope that will prompt some useful conversations, both for yourselves, whatever stage of the journey you're at, but also for the profession more broadly. And we hope that by kind of talking a bit about this and by starting that conversation, we hope it helps you to think about your own experiences and how that might fit with where you stand in the world of psychology. Okay. In terms of how we're going to do tonight, how we're going to structure things, we're going to talk for about 15 minutes or so each. So we've all prepared just a very kind of bit of a, not quite presentation, but a bit of a preparation, a bit of a talk about what we want to say. What we want to do is just kind of give you a bit of an overview of some of our thoughts about our journey, about our experiences. We'll be taking questions after each presentation, and hopefully we'll have a bit of time at the end to do a kind of a broader question and answer or discussion type of thing at the end. So I hope that's going to be useful for people. I guess first things first, we wanted to kind of really say something as well in terms of the current context that we're in. So as you might be aware, we decided to postpone the original date for this and moved it to tonight. So thank you for your understanding in that. We decided to postpone in response to obviously the events that were going on in relation to Black Lives Matter, in response to the passing of George Floyd. What we're very mindful of in terms of talking about class tonight is how much recent events intersect with some of the issues that we want to think about, both in terms of Black Lives Matter, both in terms of the government's response to COVID-19, all of those things that are kind of really big for people at the moment really intersect with issues around class. And we're quite mindful about, or we want to try and be quite mindful about how the issues that we want to talk about tonight might fit alongside other kinds of visible and invisible difference in terms of things like race, gender, sexuality, disability and neurodiversity, just a few examples. We know that the inequalities and discrimination facing people are wide-ranging and much broader than clinical psychology, though I think it's been a very pertinent topic recently for us as a profession, thinking about access to training and the diversity of clinical psychology as a whole. So we just want to try and hold that in mind a little bit tonight, really. And I suppose, you know, in trying to write out something to introduce tonight, I'm very aware that I kind of sit here as, you know, a white male in a nice, safe house with the sun shining and a full belly. My kind of privilege is very sort of front and centre in my mind, thinking about how that compares to other people's experiences. And whilst tonight we might be talking about some of the challenges of coming from a working class background, my goal isn't to kind of compete or to say my experience is more difficult than yours, and I don't think any of us are coming at it from that point of view. We don't want to come across as saying, oh, I'm special or unique for overcoming this barrier or that barrier, because we don't think that's helpful. What we want to do tonight is really just sort of start a conversation and think about how we can share stories, share experiences to hopefully help each other. We know that some of these conversations might not be very easy, and some of them might involve us having to look at ourselves through a different lens than what we used to, thinking about our own power, our own privileges, and I guess thinking about how our personal and professional identities are made up, really. We know that class is just one kind of aspect of that professional identity that we have. And the other thing I want to say as well is that we kind of really want to come at tonight from a place of recognising that class is a continuum. You know, I'm sure that if I asked everybody in this chat now, we'd all come up with a slightly different definition of what we mean by working class. So we're not trying to say this is what we mean by that, we're just sort of offering it as a starting point for the conversation, really. Okay. I'm aware that I've got the sun shining through my window, which is making me look a bit angelic. I'm just going to move my camera. Right, okay. I suppose the other important bit of context that I wanted to mention just in terms of introducing tonight is just about the timing of this. So we're very aware that it's kind of just towards the end of application season for the clinical psychology process. So some people may well have recently gotten onto training or potentially may have applied and not got interviews or not got a place. We know that can be a really difficult and uncertain time, really. So we just want to be explicit in what we're trying to say tonight, and that we're not going to provide you with the secret answer to getting an interview or to getting a place on training. I'd love to be able to give you that, but I just don't think I can. We want to hopefully come at tonight from a position of solidarity and of support. We want to try and think about our own journeys and reflect on our experiences to hopefully think about what some of the barriers have been for us and what we've experienced. And hopefully we hope that sharing that with you guys is useful. We also kind of don't want to come at this from a position of saying that clinical psychology training is the be all and end all. You know, there's going to be a lot of people, potentially a lot of people here tonight who don't end up in clinical psychology and end up doing other good stuff. So we kind of just want to sort of say out loud, really, that whatever your journey ends up being, we hope that just taking some time to think about your background and how maybe some of the issues we think about tonight will be helpful. Okay. Right, it's very strange doing this. I feel like I'm sort of just talking to myself, but I hope that made a bit of sense. Okay, just in terms of practicalities for tonight. So the first thing is, if I could ask you all to please just turn your microphones off and your cameras off, that'd be really helpful, just because it would help to reduce the load on the server with so many people coming in. What you can do, I think, is you can right click on the four of us, and that'll give you the option to pin us to your screen, so that'll keep us on the screen rather than different faces popping in and out. We want this to be a kind of a live chat, but obviously with so many people in, the practicalities of sorting that out is quite tricky. So how we've decided to run it is we want to use the discussion box, the chat box, which if on the bar across your screen should have a little speech bubble type icon, which opens up a kind of chat window. Please use that to ask questions or agree, disagree, raise discussion points, whatever. Between the four of us, we're going to kind of keep an eye on that, and then hopefully kind of use those prompts to start a conversation off, and you kind of take questions and things via that medium. We'll keep an eye on the questions, but we might not get to everybody's just with being so many people, so sorry if we don't make it to you. We will try and keep it as well relevant to a broad audience. So obviously with there being so many folk here, we are not necessarily going to be able to provide individualised answers or individualised guidance to people's particular set of circumstances. So I guess what we'd ask is that if you are asking a question, just please try and keep it something that'll be useful for everyone in the room. Okay. In terms of how we're going to run it, I'm going to start us off. Hopefully my heart rate will kind of come down as my anxiety reduces in the next 5 minutes. So I'm going to talk for a bit. Then we'll take some questions, and then Hannah's going to talk for a bit. We'll take some questions. Then we'll pause, have a break, get a cup of tea, and then we'll come back together. And Ben will chat for a bit, again do some questions, and then Emma will chat for a bit, and again we'll do some questions. And hopefully we've got until 9 o'clock, so hopefully that will give us a little bit of time at the end to just do potentially a bit of a broader discussion. All right. What I'll say as well is that I'm recording the session, so I'll share this online. So if you do want to ask a question or chip in with anything, that's all captured in the recording. So just be mindful that whatever you put out there will be publicly available afterwards. All right. Okay, what else have I not said? Oh, Twitter. We thought it'd be useful to have a hashtag. So if any of you are active on Twitter, please use the hashtag #ClassClinPsych. We can try and keep all the conversation going. Who knows? Maybe we'll, I don't know, trend or go viral or whatever happens. I guess the last thing I'll say just to finish, and I say this partly for my own benefit as well as for the other co-facilitators, is please do just be nice to us. We're all here in our spare time, not doing this for any payment or any benefit. So let's kind of look out for each other. Let's look after each other. We'll try and we'll try and get to your question, but apologies if we don't manage that. All right. I'm going to stop talking about practical stuff and hopefully get on to a bit more of a freestyle. I don't quite know how this is going to go, but we'll see. Okay, so I guess I will kind of start a bit by saying who I am, where I'm from. So I'm from Wigan originally. So for those of you who don't know, Wigan is a sort of little northern town, about 20-25 miles from Manchester. Quite a lot of social deprivation in Wigan generally. There's some not so bad areas, but quite a lot of quite deprived areas as well. I grew up in an area of Wigan which is not too bad, to be fair. It was kind of a fairly safe place to live, a nice place to live. There wasn't any particular, issues in that regard, but I think it was still very much, I would say, identified as being a working class town. In terms of I guess my journey into psychology, I had no idea what a psychologist was growing up. I don't think I'd ever really heard of what that actually meant. I went to when I went to high school, I went to a school in a fairly sort of socially deprived area, in a context which wasn't very, I guess, didn't really suit me and my learning style. It's probably fair to say. It wasn't really an environment that really encouraged, rewarded, reinforced a lot of learning. I then went to college and I think really struggled at college because I hadn't really learned how to learn, how to be an independent student, how to do things myself. That said, I always did all right in school, not amazingly, but got solid grades. And when I hit the age of thinking about whether or not to go to uni, it was quite a big decision. I was on the fence about it for a long time, and it was actually my dad that encouraged me to go. Although he was a bit disappointed when I ended up picking psychology as a degree. I think his exact words were, "What are you going to do with that?" To be honest, I didn't really have an answer for him. I didn't really know. I just kind of picked it because it was interesting. I'd done it at A-level, fallen into it. Just picked it because it appealed to me. I certainly had no idea about what clinical psychology was or the kind of whole process around that. I think going to uni especially was a big adjustment for me. I think growing up, I had never really learned to engage in academia or with my education. I was very passive about it. I'd never really learned how to study myself. I'd never really been one to go out and do the extra mile or do anything above and beyond what I absolutely had to. So going to uni was really quite an experience in sort of, oh shit, I'm on my own here. I've got to do this myself. No one's going to do it for me. And I remember finding that quite tough, especially for the first couple of years. I think through uni, I think I struggled, especially something that I kind of noticed was that I struggled with the idea of trying too hard almost putting in too much effort. And it's something that I've only really recently pulled the dots together and thought about, really, because I think there was almost something for me of going to uni and not really seeing it as being cool to try hard. It wasn't seen as a safe thing to do in my mind, and I think that probably links back to what my life was like at school. I remember having a friend at uni who wanted to go and sit at the front so that she could really pay attention to the lectures, and I was just like, I don't understand why you would want to do that. And it was only when she said, well, I'm paying however many thousands of pounds to be here, that I was kind of like, oh yeah, that's probably should be my mindset. And it just never was. But I think being able to go into that kind of environment, I found really difficult, and I found it hard to be kind of around folk who came from different backgrounds to myself. I found it hard to be responsible for my own learning. I found it hard to even just like practical things like knowing what a journal was. I just had no awareness of that, and it felt like I was kind of chucked in the deep end when I started uni. I certainly didn't know what clinical psychology was. I had no idea about that, and it wasn't really until I was coming towards the end of my degree that I even heard of it and started thinking about it. I was quite sort of resignedly told not to bother applying by the folks at the university. It's too competitive, it's not worth bothering with. And I kind of, I don't know, maybe that spurred me on to wanting to go down that route, I don't know. But it was definitely not something that I received a whole lot of support from at uni. That said, I think what was useful at uni was actually realising that I enjoyed this kind of work. And I remember my uni dissertation was the first piece of work I ever felt like I properly tried at. I remember locking myself away in a little room in the library and actually quite enjoying it. And it was almost like the first time I'd really pushed myself and challenged myself. I think following that, I finished uni and then kind of was at a bit of a don't really know what to do with myself sort of phase. And it was only really through lots of research online, joining discussions on forums and things like that, that I started to get a bit of a sense of what clinical psychology was. But I think up until that point, I didn't really know much about it, and I certainly hadn't really had anything in the way of role models or psychologists to kind of be around and learn from. Certainly didn't really get much of that either at uni or beforehand. I think the reason that I think I've been thinking about all of this stuff in relation to being a clinical psychologist now is, I guess, a lot of this stuff just comes out when talking to other colleagues, really. But like, I think about just, I suppose, simple things like, you know, growing up, we had a computer in the house, but only because my sister got a part-time job at the spa and bought one for herself, and I kind of commandeered it. That was the only reason I ever really got kind of the ability to get good at using a computer and get used to being on the internet and things like that. I didn't have any awareness through my family or through like people in my family network about what a psychologist was. You know, my family wouldn't have known anyone who was a psychologist and wouldn't have known anyone who knew anyone that was a psychologist. So I guess that the opportunity to ask questions, to learn how to get opportunities, even just learning how to ask the right questions was sort of never really there, I think. And I think that was quite, I think when I was quite early on in the journey of going down the clinical psychology route, I found that really lonely, actually. It felt quite chaotic. I think I worked for a couple of years in learning disability support work role, and again found that I was very disconnected from the world of clinical psychology, even though in retrospect that was a really good experience. But I ended up working for the NHS in a mental health team, and it was only really in that role that I started to be able to have proper conversations with people who knew a bit about what clinical psychology even was, and actually worked with a psychologist for the first time, which was really useful just in understanding a bit about what the role involved and that kind of thing. So it was, up until that point, I think quite an isolated experience, and I think that's one of the reasons that kind of prompted us to start thinking about putting this webinar on, really, because I think if you've not got people in your network who know about this stuff, it's really hard to know who to talk to and to know where to go for that kind of informal advice, even if it's just a bit of networking or knowing who to speak to, knowing what to Google. You know, that stuff, it doesn't just happen automatically. I think there was probably a bit of luck on my part. I think I probably did just fall into finding the right website and join the right communities online to get a bit of that networking connection. The next kind of paragraph I've written in my notes was about sort of identity, and I think a big adjustment for myself in learning to, well, through the process of training as a psychologist, I think there was a big adjustment that went on in terms of how I saw myself. I think for a long time I felt, maybe still a little bit do, felt like an imposter. I think there was something very strange about learning to fit into this very academic world that was very predominantly middle class. Learning to fit in with different placement teams, learning to fit in around my colleagues who I was training with and the people at the university, you know, where all these really bright, intelligent people talk eloquently about politics and read The Guardian and listen to Radio 4. All of that stuff was completely new to me, really. And I think that transition almost into being surrounded by folk who came from much more middle-class backgrounds, I found really difficult, because it felt like I didn't fit in there, but as time went on, it felt like I didn't really fit into my own environment either. I found that it became more difficult to talk to friends that I went to school with, for example. I think I'd love to be able to say something kind of nice, like, you know, be yourself and embrace your own advantages, but I think there is something about feeling like you've got to fit into a mould. And again, I think that's one of the big drivers behind my wanting to get things like these webinars off the ground, because that's kind of awful, isn't it? That we feel that we have to act a certain way to fit in. And that's something that I really struggled with for a long time. Even just little things like the kind of more cultural stuff. Like I remember having a conversation with some of my cohort about like what poetry they were into. It's like, I never cared about poetry. I never had any, I still don't, you know. Things like books, music, art, the stuff that you just brought up around felt completely different to me, being from the background that I was from, really. And I think that's not to say that I didn't have my own culture. You know, the things that I grew up with were incredibly important to me and to my family. But it felt very different, and it felt very difficult to relate to the people that I was around through the process of training, really, because it just felt really hard to explain to somebody why it was so important that Wigan nearly got to the grand final. You know, that it felt really difficult to communicate that in a way which wasn't connected to class. Something else I've kind of written down is about accents as well, and I think, I mean, I've not got a massive Wigan accent nowadays, but it still gets commented on. You know, people still comment on the way that I pronounce words, the way that I talk, and it's almost commented on as if it's a bad thing a lot of the time. And I think, again, this is just a massive thing that's really something that we don't really talk about or think about as a profession, you know. And I think, you know, in terms of where I work clinically now, I work in Salford, which is kind of socially quite similar to the area that I grew up in. And I actually find it really useful now to be able to, I kind of draw on my working classness in terms of the way that I talk to people a lot more, I think, than I ever felt comfortable doing when I was training. I think, if anything, if you came into the hospital there, you know, sounding like you were from, I don't know, what's a really posh bit of London? Mayfair? I'm just going off the Monopoly board. I don't know if that's right. You know, if you had a very sort of a different kind of accent, I imagine you'd have a very different challenge there. You know, I think. So I think there's something about being able to communicate in a way which is consistent with the people around you that I find really difficult. And I think being able to sort of talk the same language, use the same words, that's still something that I kind of struggle with a bit, really. And I think for years and years and years when I was training as a psychologist and the first few years afterwards, it almost felt like I wasn't doing it right. I wasn't being the right kind of psychologist because I didn't have, you know, I didn't have the nice fancy suit, and I didn't have the nice glossy beard, and I didn't talk in a certain way. Anyway, I don't know if any of you saw there was a thing that went around on Twitter a few weeks ago where somebody kind of overdubbed Boris Johnson talking, but she did it using I think it was a northeast accent, and it was fascinating. It's just an example of the inherent kind of judgments we make based on people's accents. It's worth a look. Anyways, I guess the other thing that I have been thinking about in sort of in preparation for this is the role of luck. So I think being from the kind of growing up with the background that I had, I think I've kind of attributed a lot of the achievements I've had, a lot of the getting onto clinical psychology training, getting the jobs that I've had since, I've attributed a lot of that to luck, and maybe there's part of that. I think I can kind of acknowledge that some of that is about effort and seeking out opportunities, but I think there is also a bit about being in the right place at the right time. And I think that's a really big issue for our profession, because it shouldn't be down to luck as to who becomes a clinical psychologist and who doesn't. It should be who is a good person to do that role and who is going to be in a good place to meet the needs of the people that we need to work with. So I think, again, maybe part of what's been in my mind with pulling together this as a webinar and to start this process off was trying to, I guess, really trying to share experiences and think about what we did as professionals that helped us to get to where we are, if that makes sense. And I'm sure other folk are going to talk much more eloquently about that than I am. I think in terms of the, what do I want to say? I think in terms of the challenges of training, I think I struggled quite a bit with, again, feeling quite isolated with that. I felt like my family didn't really get it. They tried their best, they really did, but they just struggled to understand why any of this was important. I remember having a conversation with some of my colleagues in my cohort about what our interview day was like. And I remember a friend of mine was saying, that her parents brought her to the interview, waited outside for her, took her out for a nice dinner afterwards, all this stuff. And I remember thinking, I don't even know if I told my mum I had an interview, and it's just a completely different world. And I guess just little things like your family being in a position to offer help and support, either on a practical level, helping out with proofreading, or on a more emotional level, like actually understanding the challenges of training or the challenges of working in this kind of a profession. I think I found that quite difficult to manage, because it wasn't that my family didn't care or didn't get it. They just didn't have that awareness. They didn't have that knowledge. And I think because of that, it was quite an isolating experience that I found quite difficult. And it took me quite a long time, I think, to almost get past that and to be able to reach a point where I feel okay talking to my family about it, acknowledging that there are some things they just won't understand. I think there is something in my mind about how the different advantages that you get from things like, I guess, coming from a background that isn't very working class, or that is more middle class or more privileged. I think there are lots of things that we need to think about as a profession, some of them quite practical, things like how we treat honorary assistant psychologists, and the value that is often placed on unpaid work, I think is really important for us to be thinking about. I never could have done that either during my degree or after my degree. I just would never have been in a position to not work full time. It just wouldn't have been feasible. I think there's very practical things that go with that, just in terms of being able to apply for different jobs. Like, I remember applying for different assistant jobs, but being really limited by geography, because I didn't have the money to move to the other end of the country. I remember having to work full time because I needed to pay to run a car, and didn't have a lot of money left over to really do much else. I definitely couldn't have gone and worked for a few days a week unpaid. That just wouldn't have been physically possible. So I think there's things like that we really need to think about in terms of how do we recognise and value the potential inequality that goes with honorary assistant work. I think there are also, maybe, I don't know, again, thinking about pulling some of this stuff together, I've been trying to think about other barriers, and I think some of the things I've alluded to already in terms of the language of clinical psychology, the connectedness to academia and to education. But I think some of it does just come from very practical things in terms of, getting better grades. You're much more likely to get a better degree classification if you go to certain universities. You're much more likely to get higher grades at GCSE A level if you come from certain places in the world. And I think these are challenges for our profession that we really need to think about. Okay, I'm just going to sort of finish because I've rambled enough at you. I just want to finish a bit by saying something about what I think are maybe the advantages of coming from a working class background, because I think whilst there certainly have been barriers and challenges that I've alluded to, I think I definitely wouldn't change my background. I think I very proudly identify as being from Wigan and mention it at pretty much every opportunity I get. So I think some of that comes in terms of clinical work, things like being aware of and more connected to some of the practical issues facing the people that we work with. So even just things like recognising that not everybody is going to have the ability to pay a bus fare to come to an appointment with you as a psychologist, I think is something that a lot of people are quite disconnected from. And, you know, at the minute, I'm not in that boat anymore. You know, I'm now a qualified clinical psychologist and a pretty good wage doing so. I don't really have to worry about those things, but I feel like because of the way that I was brought up, I think that'll always be something that's at the front of my mind, or I hope it is. I think there's also something about how those experiences kind of affected the kind of work that I want to do and the kind of, I guess, the kind of thing that I want to do as a clinical psychologist as well. And I think this profession is sort of amazing in the sense that it's so broad, you can do so many different things with a clinical psychology qualification. I think being able to work in a way which allows connectedness with people, I think, I don't know, maybe I do have a bit of a chip on my shoulder at all this kind of stuff, but I definitely don't ever see myself as working in a setting where I'm kind of just doing, you know, therapy for rich white people. That just doesn't appeal to me. You know, I think my background has steered the kind of work that I want to do, and I think it affects, my values and my ethos as a psychologist, which I hope makes me a better psychologist. And I think that's something that for hopefully everyone here, that's something that's worth thinking a bit about. You know, if you are interested in going into this profession or a similar one, how do your own experiences kind of drive what you want to do? Why do you want to do it? And I think even just thinking about these webinars has made me think a bit more about, well, how does being from Wigan, growing up in that kind of environment, how has that shaped why I wanted to be a clinical psychologist in the first place? I think this is really important in terms of the diversity in our profession, because I think at the moment we are a very white middle class profession, and I think that it isn't very diverse, and the numbers kind of speak for themselves. So I think being able to have greater diversity has clear benefits for the people that we work with. But I think in terms of my role now, you know, I work at Lancaster University, which I think works very hard to think about increasing diversity. And I think being from the background that I'm from definitely fits in with a lot of the work that we do there. I think for me, it feels very important to target input at every stage, really, from all the way from school, all the way to A levels, all the way to the degree, to really try and think about how we can broaden access and how we can make more people aware of clinical psychology as a profession, because there's going to be a lot of really great people who we could really do with as psychologists out there that just never get the opportunity, never get the leg up. And I think that's probably true of all professions. You know, I think you probably say the same about medicine, about law, about all different kinds of professional groups where you can't separate out class from how people access those kinds of professions. I think I'm winding up towards the end. I'll kind of stop rambling. I think what I'll say, I said I wasn't going to give individual advice, and I won't, but I suppose what I would say is I hope that you can use tonight to think a bit about your individuality, to think about what is visible and invisible in terms of the differences that make you you. And I hope that you can think about how that applies to your career. You know, if you are applying for clinical psychology training, I'd really think about finding a course that values that and that appreciates that, and find an application process that suits your strengths. You know, I now work for the Lancaster programme, but I never got an interview anywhere else. You know, I think I'm an all right clinical psychologist nowadays, but I never would have got a look in anywhere else off the back of my CV. I never got an interview at any other programme in the country. So I think there's something to be said for really thinking about how you tailor your application to places where you think are going to play to your strengths. I think that's about all I'll say. Yeah, I will probably shut up. If anybody wants to fire any questions into the group chat, I'm hoping, I've not been looking at it, I'm hoping some of my esteemed colleagues will.
There's a few coming through now. Will.
Cool. Any that would be useful to respond to?
There's a question here from Rachel about honorary AP posts and if they should be stopped due to the potential to discriminate against those who can't afford to work for free and give advantage to those who can.
I'm happy to say, in honesty, yeah, I think they should be stopped. I don't think it's fair. I'm aware that, and I say that having worked in departments where that has been offered, and it's always a really difficult issue because the people who I've worked with who have been honorary assistants have always been fantastic. You know, I've worked with some really great people who have come and done some really good work, and it's not their fault that they're not being paid for it. And, you know, they're not doing anything wrong, but I feel like the systemic issues around that are our responsibility as a profession. I know the BPS took a quite strong position. I think it was towards the end of last year. They released some guidance, essentially agreeing with that. But obviously, it still goes on. I think for places that do still do it, I think there's a lot to be said for how they recruit honorary assistants. At the very least, they should be thinking about their application process for that, how they shortlist, how they choose people, and how that meaningfully helps widen diversity within the profession. I don't think as a profession we do a very good job of that. But it's really difficult because I think if people are in a position where they can offer their time for free, I just wonder about, I guess, where that's best done and who they could be offering that time to. I don't know. I don't really have the answer to that, but my personal kind of perspective on it is that I think if we're going to use people's time, I think we should value it and we should pay them. Just scrolling down.
Well, there's quite an interesting one from Chelsea saying that you mentioned that you've had times when you felt a bit isolated and different to colleagues, and asked about ways in which you might have overcome some of those barriers, because it can feel a little bit stuck between one culture and another, in terms of building your professional identity.
Mm-hmm. I think in all the sort of years I've been working in psychology services and thinking about this sort of stuff, I've had more progress in that the last few weeks than I ever have before, just by the simple act of putting that tweet out. I honestly thought when I put the word out for these webinars that I might get a few responses and that I'd be going around begging mates to come and help me with them. And we were just really overwhelmed by the response. And I think what it really kind of highlighted was that firstly, there's a load of people who are really interested in this as a topic or really struggling with issues relating to this. But yet I had no real awareness of that. You know, it's almost like, oh wow, there's all these people who are working in psychology and have come from these working class backgrounds. Why are we not talking about that more openly? Why is like we're all pretending to not be from a working class background? And I don't know, that's obviously just my position on it. Others might disagree, but I think for me there's something about being able to have more explicit, open conversations about this stuff that I think is really important, both in terms of us feeling like we are part of the profession and that we belong in the profession and that we're an important, make important contributions, and that has kind of particular specific value in terms of diversity. But I think also feeling comfortable in our own bodies, in our own skin, and I think, I think if we can't name our own stuff, then we're going to run into problems. And I'll freely admit I carried a chip on my shoulder for a long time about a lot of this stuff. I probably still do. But I remember kind of struggling a lot with that as a trainee, and I think it's only really in the past few years, through having more conversations about it with supervisors, having more conversations about it with colleagues, I guess finding like-minded people to talk about, like, you know, look at Ben, we had lots of conversations about this kind of stuff while he was on placement with us. Like, that kind of ally, I think, is just dead important. And I hope that one of the things that can come from, you know, these webinars as a thing to go forwards is that other people can find other people to chat to about this stuff and to not feel so on their own with it. I'm just going to scroll down and see if there's any other questions that jump out. Sorry if I don't get to yours, I'm just literally glancing down. Ooh, I can definitely say something about this. Right, Kerry. I've noticed that a lot of courses look at A-level, even GCSE grades. So my A-levels were pants, they were terrible. I did not do well at college, I struggled with it. I did all right at school, despite, you know, not really going to a very good school. I did all right there, but really struggled at college. It just wasn't a very academic environment. Because from where I'm from, going to uni wasn't on most people's agenda. It wasn't the plan. And it's really interesting. So my partner now is very definitely not working class. She's very definitely middle class. I don't think she would mind me saying that. It's really interesting talking to her about this kind of stuff, because she'll reflect on, you know, right early on in high school, she was planning what she wanted to do at uni. You know, it was the typical journey for people from those, a lot of people from those kind of backgrounds. From where I was from, it just wasn't part of the plan. And to be honest, if it hadn't been for my dad pushing me to go, I probably wouldn't have gone to uni. And I certainly never, ever thought I would end up doing any sort of postgrad study. You know, the idea of doing a master's, never mind a doctorate, was just completely alien to me when I was at school. So the idea of, you know, at A-level, working really hard so that I could get on to do this thing, it wasn't even remotely in my mind. You know, I was just getting through the thing that was in front of me and not even really doing that. So yeah, I guess it links into the point I made earlier about, you know, wherever you're at or wherever you've been, I think if you are interested in going down the route of clinical psychology, I think you've got to be a bit strategic, because the simple fact of the matter is a lot of unis do still recruit based on things like A-level grades and degree classification. You know, I can only speak for Lancaster, but we don't. That's not taken into consideration there. There's a different route of selection, which has its pros and cons, but it's not based on those types of things. So I guess my kind of response to that is really just about be a bit strategic in where you apply and play to your strengths. Right, I'm going to shut up because I'm definitely impacting onto Hannah's time. So I will I'll look meaningfully at Hannah and hand over to her. Well, thank you, everyone.
Couldn't get my mic on there, sorry. Hi, everyone. So I don't want to repeat what Will has said, because he talked about a lot of the things that I think had come into my mind when I was thinking about this, and probably similarly for Ben and Emma as well. So I think I'll give you a bit of information about sort of my journey, as it were, into clinical psychology, and then some additional reflections, trying not to repeat what Will's already said. But I was born and raised in the northeast, in North Shields, which is a small town off the coast of Newcastle. It's the same town as where Sam Fender's from. So if you're a fan of Sam Fender, he could probably much more eloquently explain what North Shields is like in his music than I ever could. There was a lot of redundancy and ill health and things in my childhood. My parents struggled financially a lot. And I went to a high school that didn't have a great reputation, and it was in an area of really quite significant social deprivation, and I was bullied at high school for the first couple of years for being poor, and basically avoided school as much as I could for the first few years. So my attendance became a cause for concern, didn't want to go to school, and I was also bullied for trying. as well, which is probably something people can identify with as well. I did my GCSEs, did all right, went on and did my A-levels, did okay, not great. Went and did my undergrad at Polytech, a local Polytech university. One thing I didn't know about the route into clinical psychology was that I had to be BPS accredited. That's one thing I definitely knew. So I made sure I found a BPS accredited course, knew that was important. And my undergrad wasn't straightforward. We had a lot of ill health again in the family, a lot of grievances, a lot of bereavement. And I just sort of got through my undergrad, came out with a 2-1. Wasn't great, but it was, you know, fairly average. And I just followed the academic path that I assumed I'd have to follow to get to be a clinical psychologist. I'd always wanted to be a clinical psychologist for as long as I could remember, but I had absolutely no idea how to get there. And just assumed I'd just go to university, come out and walk into some kind of route to clinical psychology and it'd be fine. Definitely not like that. And I attended an appointment towards the end of my undergrad with a relative to see a psychiatrist, and my relative very proudly mentioned that I wanted to be a clinical psychologist. And the psychiatrist just went, well, good luck with that, it's really competitive. And I was like, is it? All right. So I thought I'm probably gonna have to do some research into this then, and just found this world of people wanting to pursue a career in clinical psychology. And it was, you know, going onto the forums and things that a lot of you have probably seen. It was almost like I'd gone to a party that I wasn't invited to and didn't belong in, and I was just not part of that group of people. And everybody seemed to know what they were talking about. They had all these plans. They knew exactly what they had to do to get there. And I was, you know, completely naive, not a clue of what I needed to do. And now I was coming to the end of my undergrad, and I thought, how am I going to stand out against all of these other people? I'm about to graduate with about 170 other people on my course alone who potentially want to pursue this career. So I didn't bother trying for a little while. There was a system post coming up, and I thought, what's the point? I'm not going to stand out against any of these people. So I thought maybe I should improve my academic profile first. That seemed to be the way that people were going. If they got a 2-1, you needed a first. So I hadn't done that. So I thought I'll do a master's. So I worked in a retail job at the time and did all the hours I could to try and save up for this master's. Didn't have a clue what I wanted to do with it, but I knew it had to be psychology related in some way. And I wasn't aware at the time, I think they just brought out the postgraduate loans as well. But as supportive as my family were, I was a first generation university student. My parents hadn't been into sort of any further education or anything like that, and they were very supportive and very encouraging. Just, you know, do your best and you'll get there. And so we didn't have those conversations around how to progress in this sort of career. And I didn't know where to look at all. And then I really started to struggle with my mental health and decided to leave the retail job because it just wasn't helping at all, and ended up using the money I'd saved for the master's to live off. But that coincided nicely with recruitment for there was a sort of local campaign in a mental health trust in the Northeast for Band 2 healthcare assistants. And I was successful when I applied for one of those. And they asked, you know, we're recruiting across the trust, where do you fancy going? And I said, oh, the neuro rehab service sounds good. And I ended up going there. And I loved that. While I was doing that, I genuinely considered going into nursing because I thought clinical psychology is not gonna happen. And then I was working night shift with a nurse who I owe a lot to, who said, there's an assistant job going in a brain injury service. Are you going to apply for it? And I was like, what's the point? I'm not going to be able to stand out against anybody else. And he pushed me to do it. He said, just give it a go. What's the worst that could happen? And I was successful in getting the post. And I think there was always that sort of narrative that I'd built up around myself about not being good enough, not being good enough to apply for the post, not being good enough to compete against people in interviews, if I'd been successful in getting an interview. And then it all sort of started rolling from there. So I worked in the neuro service for about 1.5 years, and then a higher assistant psychologist post came up in a similar neuro service, applied for that and was successful. Went on to a forensic learning disability service and worked there for a few years.
Oh no, I think Hannah might have frozen, unless she's just keeping very still to trick us. We'll just give her a minute, because sometimes Teams does this. We'll give her a minute and see if it catches up with itself. I think she's dropped out. Maybe while we're waiting to see if her connection kind of helps. I've just been reading back over some of the comments, and thank you so much for what you're saying, folks. I think it's really, really nice to see that what we're hopefully talking about tonight is connecting a bit with people. I'm just trying to scroll back and find it now. There was a lovely question from somebody about, I guess about how, sorry, I'm not capturing the wording of it exactly because I've lost it again. Something about how not having the diversity in the profession might impact on the way that we conceptualize problems and work with people. And I just thought that was a really, really fantastic point, because yeah, I think it absolutely does. I think pretty much all of the one-to-one therapy models that we use are completely ignorant of context and where people are, what's going on for people, you know, and just things like making sense of why people don't come to appointments because they maybe can't afford it, or making sense of why people struggle to engage in therapy because maybe they don't connect with a therapist, or even just how we start to conceptualize people's problems as being a result of the context and the situation that they're in. That's a very different way of thinking about it from seeing it as something that's centered within the individual. And, you know, to tap into a bit to what I was chatting about before, I think definitely my experiences growing up have shaped how I think I'm a much more sort of systemic type of psychologist, rather than thinking purely in terms of one-to-one therapy purely as a result of that. Hannah, are you back with us?
I am. It's never happened before, and then it happens today.
I was honestly just padding there, so I'm glad that you've returned. I'll hand back over to you. Thanks.
I'll try and remember where I was up to. I think I was talking about luck, wasn't it? Yeah, it felt like my journey was helped along by knowing people in services, and I think that really resonates with what Will was saying about if you don't have those connections with people, you can't then sort of get to know how it works and make those connections with people to be able to establish exactly what's happening. And because I always felt I'd done it through luck. This sounds like I'm bragging, but I promise I'm not. I've never applied for an assistant post that I haven't gotten. And I think that is purely because I was so terrified of rejection that I only went for ones that I thought I would get. And again, that feeds into that narrative again of, well, I'm only going to do it because I think I'll get it and I don't have to be told I'm not good enough again. And that was something that really worried me about applying for training, because you see the forums of people who have this fantastic experience, they've got amazing degree qualifications and classifications, and they've done masters and they've done sometimes even further study, and they're struggling to get places on courses. And then, you know, you've got me sitting here with a 2-1 with a bit of experience as an assistant. How am I supposed to do that? And you just have to go for it, I think, sometimes. And I think, again, what Will was saying around finding the courses that work for you as well. Similarly, I don't think I would have been successful if I'd applied for maybe some of the other courses. I know the courses in the Northeast, which would have been my preference so I didn't have to move, they do look at things like A-levels and your degree classification. And I don't score the points to qualify for even an interview and be shortlisted at those places. And I'm sure they're fantastic courses. This isn't about me, you know, berating them for not wanting me. I'm not that sensitive. But it's really hard when you get to a point where you think, right, I'm getting there, I'm doing something, and then there seems to be another hurdle that gets in the way of that. I found my sort of journey to this point was almost you climb this huge wall to get somewhere and then just find there's another huge wall on the other side of it. And it is really, really difficult when you're in that. And it's I think it's easy for me, and I'm sure, you know, my colleagues will agree, that when you're sitting on this side of the fence, as it were, it's sometimes easy to forget how difficult the journey is. There's even been times now that I'm in training where I think, oh, I can't even really remember how hard it was, because I've sort of done it, and I need to remind myself of that sometimes, of you've done it, but you've got that whole experience before that to reflect on and to take forward with you as a professional. I found, I hadn't considered this actually, but what Will was saying about accents as well, really interesting. I don't have a particularly strong Northeast accent anymore. It appears to have sort of settled as time's gone on, and I think it's not been a conscious decision, but I think I've done it unconsciously to try and appear more professional. Someone I know who works in a different profession was told to tone down their Geordie accent because it didn't sound professional. And I'm really proud of being from the Northeast, and it's something I only really became aware of when I moved away from the Northeast, because I've never lived outside of that area until now. And I really hold on to that, but I do worry sometimes that people judge me for being from the Northeast. I don't know what they think or what they might think, but I feel like there's almost a negative connotation that goes with being from the Northeast. And I hate that. I hate thinking that, but it's always something that's sort of in the back of my mind. Something that really surprised me as well, with applying for training, was I didn't consider the practicalities of moving to another area to do the course. I had a conversation with my husband around, you know, should I apply outside of the Northeast? Is that something that we could do? And he was on board with that. I was very fortunate in that sense, but didn't think about the fact I would then have to move to a new area, sell my house, find somewhere to live here, and the financial implications of that my husband had to quit his job and find a new job in the Northwest. And it's all things that I think people need to try and hold in mind when they go on this journey, that there's so much more to it than just getting onto training and being a clinical psychologist. Because as much as my parents, I'm sure, would have liked to have supported us with that, they weren't in a position to, you know, financially help us with any of that. And that in itself has been very challenging as well. And if you do want to pursue this, I would really consider not only, you know, the career employment side of it, but also the personal side of it, the financial, but because there's so much more to it. I'm trying not to repeat Will. Something that when I worked in one assistant post where I didn't necessarily feel part of the team. I shared an office with people who I didn't work with. I was sort of put there. I'm aware that one of the people who I've worked with previously in a different team is here. It's not you, but I felt very excluded. They wouldn't acknowledge me when I went into the office. I tried to engage with them, that type of thing, and I think it was just because I was an outsider. I wasn't part of their team, and I was just somebody who was using the office. But that feeling of isolation was awful, and I would hate having to go into work. I wouldn't want to go, and anyone who's made to feel like that because they're different for whatever reason, that shouldn't happen. And if it's that difference because of class, if it's difference because of race or religion or a hidden difference, it was so awful, and the thought that might happen to other assistants or even other people within the profession. So I do ask, if you are sort of pursuing this, please be kind to each other as much as possible, because it is competitive. You are competing with each other. There is that nature there, but you have no idea what journey people have been through to get to that point. Please just try and be nice to each other. You're doing it together. You're not working against each other. And that's one of the things that I really want to get across, that we are working towards this as a group, and being mean to people and, pushing people down isn't going to help you in any way. So I think that's probably, if you're working as an assistant or in any other sort of role like that, please be a bit kinder to each other if you can. I think that's about it, though, more or less, without repeating what's already been said.
Thanks, Hannah. Sorry if I stole some of your points.
No.
I was so caught up in listening to you talk, Hannah, I've not really been watching the questions. Was there any particular questions anyone had for Hannah? I'm seeing a lot of nice comments, which is nice.
Just to apologise as well, I've got a terrible blocked nose, so it probably sounds horrendous when I'm talking there. I apologise for that.
Guys, I'll just give you 1 minute to type out a question for Hannah if you've got one. Oh, that's a good one from Lucid. How do you bring up class in applications, conversations, etc.?
It's funny, I don't think I ever did, which is a shame, really. I almost tried to hide it. I think that I was from a working class background, and although I'm proud of it now, and I do almost regret not bringing that up. I think it's probably a conversation we need to have more. I know I mentioned it in my interview. Similarly to Will, I only had an interview at Lancaster. I wasn't offered one anywhere else. But I remember talking about class. I don't think necessarily in relation to myself, but I think it was something that we need to have more of an open conversation about. And if you feel like it's relevant to put on your application, I would say do it. And these forums are a nice way to start having those conversations now as well.
I think Scott has made a really nice point, which I think taps into that, Hannah, so I'm going to ask you this and put you on the spot as well.
Okay.
So Scott said about why do you think it is that we don't use our working class background as a uniqueness that we bring to psychology? I just wondered if you had a thought. It was saying about you didn't put it on your application. I just wondered if that was a conscious thing or what you thought that might be about.
I don't know whether I thought it was almost relevant or not. I think it's something that's really come across from training is that you think so much more about these things than I ever have done before, and that might just be my lack of, consideration for this. But there's everybody's backgrounds have got so much to bring to the profession, regardless of what they are. And if you are from a middle class background, that's great. Be proud of that as well. But I think it's because that culture is still there and it is predominantly a middle class sort of profession that you don't want to feel like that outsider, and you don't want to feel different. And I do hope that as we have those conversations more, it'll be something that we can talk about quite openly without feeling the need to either hide it or just not talk about it. I know that hasn't answered the question. But it's I think that's a question that I would need to go away and think about.
And I think you've kind of sort of answered a bit towards some of the other questions that have come up about whether those things are valued and whether those things are talked about, and kind of how we manage those feelings of maybe feeling like outsiders. I don't know if you've any thoughts on how far along we are towards the ideal end point of that as a current trainee. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
It's funny because when you sent out the request for people to be involved in this, a lot more people from my cohort in particular got in touch who, because it's not a conversation we have openly. We talk about difference a lot, and we talk about the impact of difference on the way we practice and on our clients, but I don't think we've ever had those open conversations about the difference amongst us as a cohort. And it was lovely to see that many people did identify as being from a working class background, and I think the fact that they felt comfortable to come forward and say that is really refreshing as well, because although it's not something that we should be ashamed of, there's definitely still that narrative there around, don't tell anyone, keep it quiet. Yeah,
and I don't know, maybe things like this are a starting point to challenge that, and maybe I'm sure there's lots of other good things that we can do, and probably what we'll do at some point is send round some sort of questionnaire to everyone who's coming along to these webinars to get ideas for what kinds of things might help.
Yeah.
Cool. Hannah, is there anything else you wanted to kind of add? Or?
I don't think so. Someone's put on here about the tests for Lancaster. I'm just seeing what that's about.
Do you want to say something? You're the most recent.
It's so burnt into my memory doing those. I did do the GMC test to get a place at Lancaster. I did it twice. I wasn't successful the first time, and although I think it's just I didn't do well enough to be shortlisted, I do like to pretend, although it's true that I had the excuse of I had my appendix removed and I was on a lot of drugs at the time of doing it. So that's my excuse, but I don't think that's the actual reason. I think the rationale behind them is that it's much more to demonstrate your ability rather than what you've achieved academically, and I do like to hope that it serves that purpose. Particularly as there's so many people in my cohort who do identify as being from a working class background. I don't know how that compares to other cohorts and how it compares to other courses, but it does suggest that it's working and serving its purpose in that way. But they're not an ideal fit for everyone, and they're not going to measure your ability to perform well in training as a blanket. So if they're not for you, I think it's again playing to the strengths of what's available to you in terms of courses. I just practiced a lot, but I can't be sure that's how I managed to get a place, unfortunately.
Yeah, I would definitely echo. Look at what each course uses as their selection criteria. It's all up on the Clearinghouse website. Get familiar with the courses that you're applying to and tailor your choices to ones where you've got a good shot. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to bring this bit to a close if that's all right with everyone. Sorry, I know there's been lots of questions that I haven't got to, so apologies if I've missed you out. Let's pause and have a break for sort of maybe 10 minutes. Does that feel all right? Enough time to put the kettle on? Let's come back together at about 20 past, and then we can carry on, and the lovely Ben is going to take over the next bit. All right, so see you all in 10 minutes or so. Thanks. Okay, folks, we're going to get going again, if that's all right. We're just aware that there has been a couple of connection issues. So if I could just, again, ask people to turn their cameras and their microphones off, that would be really helpful. Thank you. Just to help minimize just the demands on Microsoft servers. Thank you. Okay, so coming into the second half of the evening, I just want to introduce Ben, who's going to be telling you a bit about his experiences.
Hi, everybody. I feel really humbled to be following Hannah. That was a really lovely set of experiences, and thank you for sharing that. The pressure's on slightly now for me to try and top that, Hannah, so thank you. So I think I'll just follow the format that I think other people have kind of done, talk a wee bit about my own kind of career history and education history and how I've ended up where I am. So I also had a really challenging experience kind of at A level, and I think it's probably relevant to bring that up because it seems like there's so much academic focus when you're applying for training on, like, you know, what did you get at like Key Stage 3, like what, you know, what, I don't know, what did you want to be when you grew up? I really hated A levels. I kind of I started sixth form at school, and in the background to that, like a lot of different stuff was happening for me. Like I had to leave home, and I went into like a foster placement and stuff. So sixth form wasn't exactly at the top of my priority list at the time, with the result that I just never went to school. So I didn't do my A levels the first time around. I ended up, just to keep things really interesting, I went to like a further education college and did 4 A levels in a year, because I really, you know, I was really trying my best to get my hairline to recede from a really early age. And it was just dead stressful, really, really stressful and really intense. And I think the focus on education is really important, because coming from the background that I came from, education was always placed as being like the way out. You know, it was always like the golden ticket. Like, you know, if you work dead hard and you get your A levels and you get to uni or whatever, that you'll just somehow magically at the end of your undergrad degree be handed a job on like 50k a year. And as we all know, having been through a few recessions by now, that is not the case. A wee bit about just where like I kind of grew up. So I grew up in Belfast in Ireland, and North Belfast and West Belfast have some of the highest suicide rates in Europe, and some of the highest levels of like social deprivation. The area that I grew up in it wasn't near any flashpoints or anything, but there was obviously quite a lot of like sectarian violence and stuff. So, you know, it was a pretty interesting place to grow up. And it's interesting someone brought up, you know, the idea that does the fact that the profession tends to be a bit middle class, that kind of influence like our models and the formulations that we use and stuff. And I was thinking about, I think I've had this conversation with Will before, you know, there's no IAPT in the north of Ireland, or the south of Ireland actually, but it'd be interesting to, it's been interesting to think like, how would a model like IAPT work somewhere where there's, you know, really loads of historical violence and loads of like systemic difficulties for people. And I think that's a question that can probably be used in lots of different places, but it just made me think about that. So I did my A levels in a year. That was great crack. I got a place to do, I studied biology, and that was really interesting because I think as soon as I left like the very rigid kind of structure of kind of college and school and stuff, I just completely went off the rails. Like I had the idea that, you know, I only had to be in uni for like 13 hours a week was crazy to me. And I was getting like a student loan, and like my student loan didn't cover like the cost of my halls. So immediately starting off, I was in like negative, like, I don't know what it was, like 500 quid or whatever. And I immediately just had to go out and get a job. And I think that immediately set me apart from everyone else, because everyone else was kind of enjoying Freshers Week and, you know, getting steaming and going out and doing all that stuff. And like, I did that stuff too, but I was also like looking for a job during the day. And it was just dead stressful, because it was like, okay, I've made it to this point. My future essentially hangs in the balance as to whether or not Top Man are going to give me a job sorting out clothes hangers, you know, and just stuff that maybe other people, my peers, definitely didn't necessarily have to worry about. Undergrad was like a really, I don't know, a really interesting experience. And I think other people have kind of talked about that idea, feeling a bit like an outsider and feeling like, you know, they didn't maybe see themselves reflected in the people that were around them and their peers. And I definitely felt that. And if I'm honest, part of me loved that. Like I loved pretending that I was middle class, and I just thought, like, you know, that I had made it. Like, it felt like such a relief to like have felt as though, you know, I'd worked hard and I got to this point and that was it. It was sorted. And I think I came down to earth with a bit of a bump and was like, no, actually, this is just the start. And then I finished my undergrad. I came home for a while and just literally had no idea what to do. I think like throughout the time I did my A-levels, throughout my undergrad, I was just struck by the sense that there was no one to talk to. There was no pastoral support of any kind. There was no financial support of any kind. And I think just those kind of implicit kind of bits of advice or guidance or whatever that you would generally maybe rely on from your family and stuff, I just didn't have that. I think that just made everything was dead stressful anyway, but it made the whole experience, I think, definitely feel really isolating and very, you know, I felt very othered, even though I kind of acted and hung around with a whole group of people that looked very homogenous. I definitely didn't feel that way. And that was a really, really challenging, just a very challenging experience, very challenging few years. I came home, I kind of bummed around a little bit. I did a few temp jobs. I had absolutely no idea what I was going to do. I ended up applying for like teacher training, and I had this place on teacher training, and then I was thinking, well, is that really what I want to do? And I applied. The only way for me to get into clinical psychology was to do a psychology undergrad. It had to be like a BPS accredited undergrad. So I ended up doing an undergrad at Queen's University in Belfast, and that again, like Queen's has this reputation to being this really like prestigious, you know, red brick kind of fancy uni, and definitely was intimidating. I think like something that's maybe not been talked about yet is how like the spaces that a lot of the kind of golden tickets exist in are in of themselves quite intimidating. You know, they're usually nice universities and in nice areas and kind of maybe beside the Botanic Gardens in a nice part of town or whatever. You know, they're very rarely places that are familiar or, you know, in the kind of areas maybe where we've grown up in. And that in itself, I think, can be quite a wee bit unsettling. So I did my undergrad. I finished my undergrad, and one of the closing things that they told us on undergrad was like, don't apply for clinical or anything else because you have like a 5% chance of getting in. And my undergrad class was huge. It was like maybe like 400 people in it, maybe less, I don't know. But that was kind of the closing thing, like, well done, you've finished. Apply for a graduate scheme. There's literally no chance in hell that you're going to get on the clinical. And it part of that feels like it's still really true. Like it's that there are a tiny amount of training spaces, particularly in Northern Ireland. There's only one course that has, I think it's like only 12 places on it in the whole of Northern Ireland. And that means that there's kind of a very closed pool of people who will go for those places. So in a way, it was very true. And I think the experience in England is very similar. You know, people do kind of apply quite strategically to different places and work out where they're going to go based on hearsay and, or I don't know, things they've heard from different people. So I think it immediately feels like it's another hurdle. It's another, I think Hannah said something about there being these walls. You know, you kind of get over one wall and you're like, oh, great, I got over that wall. And then immediately there's another one that pops up and just kind of smacks you in the face. And that was definitely the experience. I think I finished my undergrad and I thought, you know, this is great. I've got my undergrad psychology degree now. What's stopping me? And I was like, well, there's quite a lot. So it just immediately, the reality of how competitive it is to get on the training really hit me like a ton of bricks. And then I had to think about doing a master's. So there was a conversation on Twitter a couple of weeks ago, and people talking about whether or not it was fair for like training courses to like expect people to have done a master's. And someone said something like, you know, I'm not paying like 10 grand or whatever it is to do a master's. Like, why should I get into debt? And I really wish I had had that mindset back in the day, because I think because the hurdles or the walls seem so definite and fixed. They're like, you will not progress unless you meet criteria. And I don't know whether it is down to background or what it is, but when you read that on a forum post or whatever, you hear it in an assistant group or whatever it is, it feels really definite. It feels very final. You absolutely must have this type of experience. You must write this in your application. You must do all these different things. And I think the hurdles feel required. All the hurdles feel like they're absolutely necessary hurdles that you have to definitely do. And just the question of doing a master's just seemed like, right, this is the next thing I have to do. And I was going to bring this up earlier. I think Will mentioned something about, the kind of cost involved with these types of things. And I think to me, I'd never grown up with very much money at all. My parents definitely weren't in a position to give me anything in the way of like, financial help in any way. But for some reason, debt just didn't faze me. It was just like, yep, sound, student loans, 40 grand, great, let's go. And I don't know why that is. And I don't know whether it is because so much of my early life and childhood was just shaped around just constantly being in debt, like my parents just constantly being in debt, and that being being terrifying, like absolutely petrifying thing, but it just being kind of a way of life. And I think probably that's kind of leached into my approach to education. It's been like, well, okay, I owe student loans, like whatever it is, like 40K. They're never going to get that money back. But, it's just kind of a necessary hurdle that had to kind of be overcome. The master's that I did, the difference with it was that it wasn't something that I just did just to tick it off in a box. I did actually love it. I did like an applied psychology master's at the University of Ulster in Northern Ireland, and it was fantastic. It was all taught by clinical psychologists. It was people who were really, really passionate about what they did. And where it was located in Northern Ireland, it was in the northwest, which again has some of the highest rates of social deprivation in Europe and some of the highest suicide rates in Europe. So it was somewhere that it felt like it was really connected to the local community, and those kind of issues with regard to mental health, it felt like you were a bit closer to being on the ground. The people that were teaching you about all this stuff, it felt directly connected to what it is I wanted to do. Whereas the undergrad just felt like this feels like 500 miles away from anything resembling what it is I want to do with my life. So the master's actually, I think, probably reaffirmed my interest in pursuing clinical training. Again, another hurdle was I finished the master's and I was like, right, can I apply to training yet? And they're like, no, like there is, you need to have an assistant post, you need to have X amount of experience, you need to do all these different things. I absolutely was in no position at all to do any honorary work. Like just absolutely not. And again, that felt very final. It felt like, well, I can't do that, so that's it over. I got a job with a charity as like a support worker, and I stayed there for a couple of years and kind of went up a wee bit and ended up managing like a couple of different projects. And that work really reignited my passion probably to keep going, because I had a little bit of responsibility. I was working with a population who, historically haven't had a lot of equity when it comes to like mental health or social services and stuff. And it just made me feel dead passionate about just working with people. And it taught me the art of small talk. It taught me the art of like being able to sit in a room with someone and have a cup of tea and not necessarily need to pursue an agenda, just be with a stranger, in a kind of professional capacity. And I think that's something that's probably been really useful to me now, not sitting in a room with someone, making them feel as though I'm about to drill them with a whole lot of questions, actually just sitting and having a very natural conversation is probably something that's stood to me now in the work that I do. Did that job, kind of worked as a support worker role for a couple of years, and then I did eventually get an assistant post, and it just was sheer luck, as Will kind of mentioned. It was sheer luck that I had a supervisor when I was for my first assistant post who was lovely, like really, really, really nice. I think we probably couldn't have been further apart in terms of who we were, but she was really, really lovely and really supportive, and did things like offered to kind of read over my personal statement and all that kind of stuff, and what just was really, really helpful. I think someone brought up in one of the questions earlier about how much kind of yourself or your working class background or whatever that you put into your form. I kind of was involved with a couple of different, sounds dead like nefarious, is like an awesome underground, but like I was in like an assistant group, and I joined like a couple of kind of online forums, and I found some of the advice and guidance that were on those things were really conflicted with that. So I instinctively would have brought a lot of myself into the forum and kind of talked a lot about my personal experiences and reflected on why that had brought me to the point of applying for clinical training. I was told multiple times that was absolutely the wrong thing to do, and no, just that's the kiss of death for your application. Like, you might as well go back to Top Man and start stacking hangers. Because it was very much like, the courses are looking for a very specific person, someone who absolutely has their shit together and, is academically very capable and all these different things. And I think now that I'm on the other side of training, I can kind of look back at that and see that the narrative that exists within some kind of assistant circles, it is incredibly competitive. And I think Hannah kind of touched on this. It's not outwardly nasty necessarily, but I think there is just that very striving urge to get on. And when everyone's kind of joins in that race together, I think some people get trampled. And I think I've definitely kind of seen that from afar. And just, I think that was probably the only thing that stuck in my mind. It was like, well, do I actually want to be part of this? Because it just feels very, I don't know, it's just horrible, just not very nice. And it definitely didn't sit with me in terms of who I am as a person and my kind of values. And I'm far too laid back to be arsed, to get involved with anything like that. It just feels like it's an awful lot of work for very little payoff. But so I had an assistant post. I applied to a couple of courses. So Queen's in Belfast is the only training programme in the north of Ireland. I applied there. I applied to a couple of others in England, and I got a couple of interviews. I had really, really wanted to go to Glasgow, just because I got family in Glasgow and I got lots of friends there. And I looked at like the entry criteria, and they were like, no, like unless you got a first, and Jesus himself gave you the certificate, no, like don't apply to us. And I did email them and inquire about that, and they were very much like, no, like we just don't accept applications from anything. I think it's like a high 2-1 or a first or something like that. And just the process of putting the application together and writing a statement and asking for feedback on the statement and pulling on that stuff, with that niggle in the back of my mind that this might all be futile. At the end of the day, someone might look at your form and say, no, this person has scored, I don't know, a 12 instead of a 16. It just felt like really arbitrary as well. Like whose measuring stick is this? And I think I've always really struggled to marry up the link between, say, your A-level grades and your undergraduate performance with how good you'll be as a clinical psychologist or how capable a psychologist you would be. And I know that there's practical reasons for that, and I don't know, but I really, really struggle with that still. I struggle with, who is it that we're looking for to come into the profession when we set these quite, I don't know, arbitrary guidelines that feel very disconnected from real life. At the end of the day, we're working with people in distress a lot of the time, and I don't know that someone who has a first or someone who has a 2-2 that'll be the decider. I don't think anyone's really bothered about what your degree classification is. So I applied to a couple of courses in England. I got a couple of interviews, and I got onto training at home and also in Liverpool. And that presented me with a bit of a dilemma because I was going to have to move. And I think Hannah said this, it's just really expensive. And I really, as much as, I'm not really arsed about getting into debt, I did begrudge like just the idea of having to launch out, hundreds and hundreds of pounds to do all that. And it's just a faff. Apart from anything else, it's just an absolute faff, like having to pack up your stuff and relocate. But I did think that, training, I trained at Liverpool would be a really good opportunity. And And it was, I met loads of lovely people and had some great placements with some really good supervisors. And I don't think I would have had those opportunities necessarily at home. But as Hannah has kind of talked about already, it's just incredibly expensive. And I think that is something to bear in mind, the kind of the thought about cost and how much I'm going to be paid for different things, and how much is your pay after the tax and everything. Like, how much actually is that, and how much is rent, and how much is council tax, and and all these different things. Like, that is a clear and present danger. Like, that's never far from the top of my mind, especially when I came over for training. And I lived in an absolute tip for the first like 6 months I was in Liverpool, because it just was like, I just don't know. I think it always comes back. Somebody said this about I don't know who it would, like, going to a party that I wasn't invited to. That kind of thing of, I just didn't know who to ask. I just didn't, I didn't have connections necessarily with assistant groups or anything like that. I didn't have any links with like professionals over here or anything. And I just felt I was just completely going in blind. And like my stepdad drove me over, and he was just like, are you sure this is like what you want to do? Because it just felt like it was just the most insane thing to like give up what he saw as being, quite a stable job and everything else at home, somewhere quite secure, to kind of sacrifice that to like take the leap to move across the water and start kind of a new life. But I think that's just the Irish way of being as well, just like dispersing yourself around the world. There was something else I wanted to mention as well, and I can't think what it is. It's just went out of my head. I think Will had said about kind of what had worked, like what had been helpful. And I think we as a group, we were talking about this a couple of weeks ago. And although the pressure to get onto training and the pressure to get an assistant post and the pressure to get the masters and all this kind of stuff is ever present, I think one thing that I was really fortunate with is that my family don't really know what I do and don't really understand what I do. And not that they're not arsed, but they're, it's not something to talk about. So the pressure to get on and to do all that stuff all came from me. I didn't have that external pressure to like be doing, I don't know, be doing amazingly well or to be getting firsts or anything like that. From my family's perspective, it was, amazing that I went to uni at all, and I was the first person in my family to go to uni. And I think in the eyes of my family, you can never really top that. It's like, right, you've gone to uni now, shut up and get on, contact us whenever you've won the lottery. And I think that actually was a bit of a relief, because it let me off the hook for that kind of, I wasn't under loads of pressure or loads of expectation from other people. I think I definitely put myself under pressure, but I was able to kind of work with that a little bit better. And that definitely was a real positive. I think there is a sense of loneliness there, because you don't necessarily, I think Will said about, other people kind of getting picked up from their interviews and stuff and kind of treated to dinner out and everything. Like, my dad's just like, do you want a cup of tea? There's never any kind of chat about, oh great, let's do something. But in a way, actually, that's really lovely. It's very normal. It's not, there's no, I think this whole experience would have been really difficult if I was worried about disappointing other people, because I already put quite a lot of pressure on myself to, not disappoint myself. So I think that would have been really, really tough. But it's just kind of, I don't know, swings and roundabouts. I was on placement with Will as a trainee, and that's I think that's where some of our early conversations about this sort of thing arose. And now and again, Will had to tell me, just to kind of shut up and stop raging against the machine, because now and again, I think I probably do allow the chip on my shoulder to come into play. And I was thinking about, because I think everyone so far has kind of talked about that, the idea of having a bit of a chip on the shoulder. And I think as long as you're aware of it and you're able to name it, I think actually, what is it? It's kind of being mindful of the hurdles and barriers and systemic challenges to pursuing a career when you're not from a privileged background necessarily, or you don't have access to the resources that are unevenly distributed. And I think that's not necessarily something to be upset about. So I wear my chip on my shoulder with with pride. Now and again, it needs to calm down, definitely. But I think it's definitely useful, and I think there are some contexts that I've worked in where being from the background I'm from has been really, really helpful. I think, I've probably felt at ease in certain situations that maybe other people wouldn't have, or yeah, I think like when coming up with like formulations and stuff, just thinking like, is this understandable to, who's this for? Is this for me or is this for them? And just that in and of itself has been really, really helpful. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to shut up and let someone else talk. I don't know if there's been any questions or anything, but yeah.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, time is moving quickly on. Sorry, that's my fault because I talked for so long at the start. Still everyone else's time. Has anyone got any questions for Ben at this point? Or we can, if you want to hold on to them, and we can do a bit of a kind of panel type thing a bit later on. I just say in a minute or two, Emma's gonna have a bit of a chat as well. We had originally planned to finish at 9. That's now looking a bit optimistic because that's in like 13 minutes. So if you are willing or happy to stay with us a bit past 9, you're more than welcome. If you want to clear off and go and sit in the sunshine for a bit, that's fine too. We'll keep the recording going, so we'll make sure the whole thing's streamed somewhere. So if you want to catch up at a later point, that's absolutely fine. Okay, here's a nice easy question for you, Ben. What if you don't have any A-levels?
Okay, well, I have a good answer to this. So I went to this like widening access like summer school thing at the university when I was a kid. And so they do like an access course, which basically completely overwrites the need for like GCSEs and A-levels. It's really, really, I mean, the difficulty is that it's not funded and that you usually need to kind of be able to fund yourself through it, but you can do it part-time. And that just, as long as you pass that and you're eligible to apply, I think they specify you have to have a certain mark or whatever, but as long as you get that, you'll get on to whatever degree you kind of want. And then once you're on your degree, it doesn't really matter after that.
And James has made a really nice point about I like the idea of calling on others to chip in when we recognise the chip on our own shoulders influencing us in some way. And as someone who you love talking about the chip on your shoulder, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on how it feels to sort of have other people comment on that or talk about that.
I think it's it's one of those things, like as long as you're aware of your own stuff and you can name your own stuff and you have a healthy sense of yourself. I think all of us have quirks and things that we're particularly sensitive about, or things from our own experience that are a bit sensitive, and it's like anything else. I think it's just being mindful of that. I think where the chip on the shoulder becomes a bit of a pain in the arse is where it's projected onto other things or people or whatever, and that's where it becomes a bit more problematic. But no, I think it's useful. It's information. I think it's yeah.
It makes me think a bit, Ben, about something I remember we talked about when we were working together about. So just for context, the hospital we worked in had it covered quite a big geographical footprint, and you had real disparity in terms of the types of areas it covered. So it covered some quite affluent areas, as well as some really quite socially deprived areas. So the clients we would sort of see coming through our services, you would get quite a big variety. And I remember a conversation we had, Ben, where we were sort of sharing a bit about how there were some people we found it easier to work with than others, and almost it being harder to empathise with people from a very sort of privileged background, a very middle class kind of, coming in with the kind of first world problems kind of thing. We found that professionally really challenging to work with. I don't know if you remember that conversation.
Yeah, no, I do, because it's come up for me now, like post qualification and stuff as well. I think it's probably just meant that I've had to be a bit more like ruthlessly reflective, but actually, to really examine that, whenever I feel that kind of unconscious pull one way or the other, to actually examine that and think, well, who does that belong to? Is that really that, this person who's in distress isn't deserving of support? No, it says more about me than it does about them. And again, it's just about being mindful of that, mindful of prejudices in general, because we all have bias and stuff that we're not always mindful of.
Yeah, absolutely. All of our stuff, don't we? And I think this is, I don't know, maybe one that doesn't get talked about as much. The whole class thing doesn't get talked about as explicitly as other types.
Yeah, and it's not talked about always in the other direction. You know, what is it like to be someone with a bit of a chip on the shoulder who, you know, is in a very suddenly well-off service or area or whatever, or dealing with a different, you know, clients from a different background. And I mean, I don't think it happens that often, but it's definitely something to bear in mind, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Okie dokie. I'm going to move us along, if that's all right, and hand over to Emma, who can tell you a bit about her background, her experiences.
Thanks, Will. Yeah, it's been so interesting listening to everybody else's experiences. And I noticed that on the comment boxes, somebody had asked something about is a non-traditional route to clinical psychology perhaps one of the better avenues to psychology for people from a working class background. I don't know if I have a view about that, but it certainly has been true for me, I guess. So I am from an area of North Manchester called Moston, and when I was growing up, late 70s, early 80s, it was very, it was a particularly diverse group of people. It was pretty predominantly white Catholic families, really, in Moston at the time. Not so much now. It's really international and diverse where I'm from now, which is lovely to see. But when I was growing up, it was a community of people who were bus drivers, milkmen, bin men. My family, my parents were school cleaners, my grandparents were as well. But there was also a lot of, I think, thinking about the positives of a working class background, there was a lot of richness as well. So I think maybe this is part of the religious context that we were in, that education and learning for its own sake was very highly valued in my family. So my parents were very voracious readers, and I read from an early age, and I think that was really beneficial looking back. I think my parents had, I think there's lots of competing sort of unwritten, unspoken hopes for children of my generation, I think, growing up in those contexts, and that they wanted you to do well, but not too well. I think my parents had a vague idea it'd be brilliant if I could be a solicitor or be a doctor, because maybe that's all they really knew about good jobs. That would be really good. Getting to university would be really good. But I don't think they really knew what those jobs were, particularly, apart from going to the doctor or whatever. But I think that was a real high hope. But also I'm very conscious, we'll talk to them in the beginning of the webinar about the intersections of different contexts as well. So as a woman from a working class background, there's lots of do well, but not too well. And, you know, there'd sometimes be comments about, you know, nobody really likes clever girls that much, you know, big Ed, you know, too big for her boots, that kind of thing from different corners. So really complicated messages, I think. So I did well in school, but something that Ben said really struck me about, I was not a striver. I'm not sure I was a lazy kid, but I was quite a daydreamy kid, and I'm quite happy with that. I was not a striver. I did well, but without tons of effort, I will willingly admit. And then I went to, I guess looking back, it was lucky that it was a positive opportunity, but I went to a church school in Oldham, which is just north of Manchester, and that was because I'd been to church as a child and managed to get a vicar to give me a reference, and I was very cross because I wanted to go to the girls' school round the corner, which was probably not the best, but my mum and dad wanted me to go to a better school, so I went 3 buses a day to the wilds of Oldham to secondary school and hated it. Did not like authority very much. Probably similar now. So yeah, it was fine, but got through school, and then I went and did my A-levels, and I think I had a sense that I did want to go to university, but to be fair, I think that was only because I was wanting to put off working for as long as I could. And I think that wasn't because I didn't want a job. I just didn't want the kinds of jobs that I knew about. You know, I was sort of resigned to the fact that at best I might be, and this is not to disparage these jobs at all, but maybe I'll get to be a cashier in a bank or something that would mean office type work. But even then, it felt a bit bleak to me, really. So to put it off as long as I could, I thought I like reading novels, love poetry, all that stuff. So I'll go and do English, and strangely I ended up doing undergrad in the 90s at Lancaster, which I ended up going back to many years later. And I loved that university experience. And something, I guess, prior to the webinar, I've been thinking about lots of cultural ways in which people from identify as a working class background might be disadvantaged or might be advantaged. But I think that somebody mentioned something that's really important about money. Money is important. So I went to university on a full grant. I had no university debt, and I think I was probably one of the last people from my type of background that had that luxury. So you could go to just learn, to read books, to do a few assignments if you could be bothered, just to go scrape through, make sure you can stay in, to have a good time. And I met people from different backgrounds, and it was an amazing experience. For the first time, I learned what rocket salad was. All sorts of just amazing experiences of just thinking, what is this? It was an absolute eye-opener, and I loved it. And then towards the end of that experience, I had to work too in the holidays only, which was good. And I ended up doing some temping in the holidays through, just by chance, I had a phone call to say there's a homeless hostel in central Manchester that needs somebody on the reception desk. So I went and worked in a homeless shelter for the summer and absolutely loved it. It was council run, but it was sort of like being a student. Everybody wore just their sloppy clothes, and everybody was just very chilled, but people were really passionate about the work. It was fantastic. So then when it came to finishing university, I guess I could see people looking in directories about graduate jobs with firms like BT and things, and I just couldn't. So in the end, a job came up as a support worker in the homeless hostel that I had been working in, and I went for that. And my mum and dad were really pleased with that. Working for the council, you'll never be out of a job. Good pension, absolutely fab. Stick with that, you'll be fine. So then for about the next 16, 17 years, I moved around, and that's where I spent a lot of time in homelessness services. Then I later specialised in working with women and families who'd experienced domestic abuse, and then later in safeguarding teams, mainly doing training work, to be honest, and sort of specialising in those kinds of areas. I loved it. And part of that involved meeting people from different disciplines and doing joint work around training or policy development. And I met some clinical psychologists, and I really enjoyed working with lots of different people. I love social workers, and I did toy with doing social work qualification. But I think once I got to know a little bit about the work of clinical psychology, it really resonated for me, and I thought it's a broad church. Somebody said it's a really broad church. There's lots of different things you can do with it. You can be yourself in it, and it really appealed. And I think then about 2008-ish, there was the economic crash, and that really started to be felt. And I think, to be honest, I think one of the things that I saw where I worked was sort of women who were not that much older than me, who were really good at their jobs, really brought a lot to the organisation, being really pushed around. They didn't necessarily have much power or control over their work, didn't necessarily have formal qualifications, but were brilliant. And I could see this happening to people around me, and I think that was another push to think about getting a qualification, hopefully in clinical psychology, because the reality is it gives you autonomy and control and choice. And I think that has to be acknowledged, really, that for many jobs that people from my background went into perhaps didn't the same. So I'm not sure I fully intended to go down the clinical psychology route at that time, but I had that in mind. But I've been out of education for so long, I decided to do a master's degree part-time. I worked part-time for a bit. I was lucky enough that I was in a relationship where we could just about manage to afford that. So I went to do a part-time master's that was a conversion psychology at Manchester, and I absolutely loved it. I loved all aspects of it. I thought it was the best thing, really interesting. And I think that sort of solidified the idea that I wanted to think about clinical psychology. And I think maybe about something for people to think about is we might not have traditional types of networks that we can use and draw on to create opportunities, but hopefully they'll inevitably be informal networks that you build up over time. And if you look out for opportunities, talk to people, then hopefully there are ways around things, through things that might not be the traditional route. And I was lucky enough that I was able to. Now, this is a tricky one, talking about honorary assistants. I do have complicated feelings about this, but obviously not so much that I didn't do it. So I was an honorary assistant part-time 2 days a week for a year on a neuro rehab unit like Hannah. I think it's complicated. Even now, I'm not sure what I feel about that, but I sort of had the sense that I probably would need some clinical experience, so I did that. And then, again, like some people have mentioned, I was looking places, didn't have much clinical experience, not the usual route. So yeah, that was sort of my path. And I think, building on something that Ben said, and I'm conscious of the time, so I'll try and be quick. I think that I was lucky enough in many different ways from my context to approach the process of training with curiosity, not pressure. I was able to do a little bit and think, oh, quite like this. This is all right. Maybe I'll have a go and do the next bit, something else. That might be really interesting to try that. Oh, this is quite interesting, try this. And then, yeah, I think once I sort of got to the end of the Masters, I surprised myself by turning into quite a stridey person, because I think for the first time I could see that there was a direction, that there was something that this was leading to, rather than just having a good time for a little while. So, yeah, and I'm not sure I always like this stridey person. I'm quite keen to get to the point where I'm perhaps not so stridey for a little bit of a relaxed place might be good. But taking the step back and, I don't know, trying to enjoy the experience and trying to have see it as a bit of with an adventurous spirit, really. And that's easy to say. I know it can be hard to do. Yeah, so other things that I perhaps wanted to say were about definitely playing to strengths. So thinking about what your cultural background brings to the profession and trying to really emphasise that as much as you can. One of a home that I've really felt happy in is in systemic with a big S family therapy world, because it's very keen on understanding difference and understanding context, and your background will give you loads of competencies, richness of experience that you can bring, and really thinking about what that is. But also the reality, there is an element of embodying clinical psychology, and you can play along with that as much as it feels comfortable for you. But I definitely think, to an extent, I've probably joined the grammar of clinical psychology a little bit. I think something that I've noticed in the interview process is that people can say the same things but use the language of clinical psychology, and it somehow makes it that bit more accessible to people in the profession. They get it. So I couldn't understand what people were going on about when they were talked about clinical supervision. So I had clinical supervision. I just think it's just this supervision like I've always had, and not really fully getting that. So I think there is a language to clinical psychology that maybe sometimes can be a bit excluding, and acknowledging that as well, and helping people to familiarise themselves with the lots of different cultural aspects of it, really. Probably chun on forever, but Will, that's the main thing that I think I wanted to say. I don't know if anyone else got anything they wanted to ask about it.
Thanks, Emma. You made me think about in a couple of things that you said there, talking about firstly the intersection between different sort of characteristics, for want of a better word, kind of talking about the intersection between class and gender, but then also thinking about language. It just made me think of, sorry, I forget his name, the person who asked the question before about how, if we don't have that diversity and the diversity within the profession, what does that do to the way we kind of think about and conceptualize problems, you know? That's not really a question, more of just a, I don't know, I guess what, the thing I was thinking about was like, I think as a male from a working class background, I think that gives me a bit of a sense of I suppose thinking about some of the guys I might meet on a ward who might just be angry, you know, and they present as being angry, but really they're afraid, you know, or they're worried, they're anxious, but it comes out as anger because in the way that they were brought up, that was the language of expression. That's how emotions were kind of conceptualized. I don't know, I'm rambling a bit here because I don't have a question, but I'm just going to throw that back at you because I think you might have something interesting to say in response.
Yeah, I think it's interesting I think that if you have an awareness of the different influences on your life and experience, I think that and I think, I'm sure you can have that from any background. It's not necessarily from a working class one. To say about it, I think it's helping people that we work with. It's this idea. It sort of links to the idea that Ben was talking about. This sort of slightly political perspective here, but this sort of fake idea of a meritocracy. If you just do well enough at school, you'll be away. Just do well enough at university, you'll be away. And I think that individualistic kind of approach, I see that in clients all the time. If I'd have just done this, if I'd have just done that, if I'd have, what about that internalized blame and guilt? And so I think maybe we can offer a uniqueness of experience to say, I can relate to so many of the things that you're saying. And from my perspective, I can see that all of these different influences might have had an impact. And that doesn't mean we can't think together about how to make changes, how to effect change. You're not passive recipient of this distress. There's lots of things we can do, but helping people to feel, bringing a non-blaming approach and encouraging people to see things from a different perspective. I think that's why I really like working in older people's services as well, because I think there's an awful lot of internalization of being old, and COVID has really contributed to that. So I'm working now with older people. It's not all your Vera Lynn generation. It's your early baby boomers now. And I've got, sort of women in their 70s saying, who has the right to tell me I'm elderly? Where's all this? The language is absolutely unbelievable. So drawing people's attention to language as a signifier of what they're internalising about. I don't know if that's what you're asking, Will.
Yeah, no, I don't think I really knew what I was asking, but I think that's a really important kind of point to think about. And I'm going to bring it back, if I can, a bit with a question, which is, how do you think being from the background that you're from ties into your awareness of some of those issues that you're thinking about there? I think the background, speaking from my personal experience, I think it's understanding the complexity of the different influences, and it helps me be curious about and trying not to make assumptions about what is helpful, unhelpful, what's good, what's bad, because there's almost always a mixture of usefulness and unhelpfulness in people's background and experience. I think maybe there's a danger, if you're not from a working class background, to assume that it's all disadvantage for you. There's going to be loads of disadvantage here, loads of poverty, loads of this, or let's look at your background and see how that, rather than helping people to think about what story they want to tell about those experiences, what strands they want to pull out. Not to deny those disadvantages, I think that's unhelpful, but also think about who gets to tell your story, really, and thinking about what you want to privilege or not. So I think what I bring is being able to hold complexity. It's both and kind of ideas rather than even or, holding lots of different complexity in my mind and learning to feel okay with that. So, your background was great in this way, really difficult in that. That's okay. Those two, we don't have to reconcile those ideas. So I think I spend a lot of time with people, helping them think through who says being working class is difficult, who says being older is difficult. Is that how you want to think about that? Are there alternative ways of thinking about it? So I think there's both thinking about stories as well as thinking about maybe the political reality as well, that I hopefully am trying to bring, having worked through all that stuff myself, I guess, trying to over time, thinking, yeah, what do I want to say about this or not? Hopefully. Thank you. Any other questions for Emma while we've got her in the hot seat?
Somebody's systemic work always attracts my attention. Yes, the more converts to systemic ways of working, I am always on board with. Social constructionist is the way forward. The more converts I can get onto that, the better. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's about that idea of power.
Emma, can I ask a really mean question? There might be people in the group who don't know much about what that means, because I definitely didn't. Can you define that in a sentence or two?
Excluding language. Yeah, so I guess that I naturally found a home with ways of working that assumes that it doesn't assume there's no objective truth in the world. Aeroplanes fly, obviously, that happens. We don't, that there's medicine is real, COVID is a real thing, but in terms of our lives, systemic with a capital S, takes a slightly different stance, that opposite of a medical model stance, I guess, of thinking about narratives in our lives, that we are made by interactions with other people. It's not necessarily, there's less of an emphasis on personality, of individual traits, of how we're born, that sort of nature idea, but that actually we're all created in conversation, in language with other people. We create each other in our communities, really, through what we share and what we don't share. So it's very much a sort of interactional kind of approach to life, that we create the stories about us in conversation with others. So, for example, as a child, I dropped a few plates as a kid, and very quickly got the label, Emma's pretty clumsy. So clumsy Emma got knocked around for quite a long time, but now I'm nearly Dr. Emma. I challenge these things and said, no. That's a narrative you've chosen to tell about me, and I'm choosing to choose a different one. Sorry, yeah. Systemic people aren't always great at explaining things in easy language. I'm sorry if that makes sense.
No, I think that made sense. I think it's I suppose it's about context, right? It's about context. Seeing, not centering the problem as being within the individual. It's about seeing it as being a part of a bigger system.
Contextual, interpersonal relationships, absolutely, that we're informed by loads of influences, and it can be useful to notice those, definitely.
There's a lovely point made here by Connor, saying about how we conceptualize mental health and the language we use to describe distress or express emotion. Made me think about how we refer to people as having or not having psychological insight. On whether what we're really referring to is whether the way that somebody interprets emotion matches how we talk about it. I think that's a brilliant way of a brilliant theory. How many times have you heard the phrase psychological mindedness? They're not psychologically minded, or they're not ready for therapy.
So true.
It's bollocks, isn't it? Okay. I don't know. Have you any thoughts on, I suppose, sticking with that systemic theme? Are there any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it for me, it almost always comes back to power. Who gets to tell the stories? Who gets to create the language? Who gets to use it? So the more diversity, as you say, we have in the profession, the more voices we'll have to enrich, I think, that language, and more voices to shape what happens. Why should it just be a set group of people that get to decide on labels, on language, on theories, on models? So it's in everybody's interest to have that diversity, not just people from working class backgrounds' interest to have that widened out. I think the profession is impoverished by not having people from different backgrounds. So absolutely,
Yeah. There's something really interesting about power, isn't there? In terms of, if you're the psychologist, the professional, and you're there in your fancy suit with your nice shoes on, and then you have somebody who comes from, perhaps a very deprived kind of background, that immediately sets a tone for that relationship that you might just never get over, you might never get past. I don't think I'd want to see a psychologist that was like that.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And I guess that's another thing with systemic work, is that the professional is not the expert, and that is something that, conversations about who is the expert about what, absolutely,
Okay. Thanks, Emma. I suppose what well, that was about as much as we'd planned. I know it might not seem like it, but we did sort of plan that. It might have felt a bit chaotic, but we did pretty much plan what order we were going to speak and everything. This is the bit where we haven't planned. So I guess maybe, what time is it now? It's 9:15. I guess maybe just for 5-10 minutes or so, if we could just throw it open, really. Has anyone got any questions, comments, thoughts, opinions, rants, anything at all that they want to say or feedback, and we'll, as a group, we'll try and sort of come up with some sort of response. This is the worst bit about doing online teaching. You ask a question and then you just have to wait. I feel like we need one of those, like, you know, like on Countdown where they have the timer like ticking down. Do you remember Countdown? Like the thing ticks down. Did it? Right. Question.
Oh no, it's still going. Yeah. I don't know if people would find it helpful to use the hand signal if they want to talk.
Ooh, that's a good idea. Yeah, that's a really good idea actually. Yeah, so on the bar going across your screen next to the chat button, there's a little hand doing this, which should flag up who wants to say something. Ooh, this is a really nice point about from Rachel. So Rachel said, I know many people from a working class background do find white privilege a difficult term to accept or identify with when they do not feel privileged. I wonder how we can have these conversations about racism while validating these experiences. Do you know, that's a fantastic point. I was going to say, I had it on my notes and I glossed over it, I think, but I was going to say something about how defensive people can get about these issues. Like, and I think it's something that, like, or the amount of people when I was doing these tweets and what have you, the amount of people that like were like really cautious about identifying themselves as being working class, like, oh, I don't know if I qualify as being working class. But I think there's a defensiveness, like nobody would want to be called like posh. I think we almost throw that around as a bit of an insult. So yeah, it's a really, I don't really have a conclusion to this, but yeah, there's something really difficult about the way we talk about these things in a non-blaming way, in a way which, like say, Rachel validates. I don't know, any thoughts, guys?
I have a thought. So I think, if I'm honest with myself, I probably struggled for a while acknowledging that I had white privilege, definitely, because I think I kind of been through the foster care system and like had lots of different, like, I don't know, just lots of different challenges and lots of different like aspects of like material deprivation. I think what I've kind of learned in the last few years is like, yes, those things were hard, but they weren't hard because of your race. You know, it literally was, you know, white people can still experience like material deprivation and everything else, but it's not contingent on your skin color. And I think that really helped me kind of understand that. And I think that defensiveness probably was about me guarding my own kind of sense of trauma, I suppose, or, you know, just sense that I had been through loss and been through difficult times, and being probably quite defensive about that. And I think that probably, and I think what can happen is, because we kind of had this discussion when we rearranged this talk, was that it can shut down conversations, you know. So instead of us kind of either plowing ahead with this discussion a couple of weeks ago and not really being mindful of the context that was going on, or just shutting down altogether, like neither of those things is helpful. But I think it's just about acknowledging that absolutely it's something that we benefited from. I think, you know, we all talked a wee bit about luck, and I think that luck is undoubtedly has its roots in race and all those kind of things, and definitely the privilege that you hold, maybe, and definitely without being mindful of it until the last kind of few years. Absolutely.
Erin's asked about, now we're educated to a high level, have a good salary, is the sense of losing touch with your working class roots. I think it's interesting that for me, I think that sort of, for me, that's a process that happened from A levels on, I think, really, of feeling, yeah, a little bit perhaps outside. I remember certainly I think education does change you, does expose you to different experiences, and that can be difficult. I think nobody really likes change, and families are no different. I think that can be quite hard. So I don't live in Manchester anymore, and I don't go to Astor-cum-Ilk anymore. You know, there's that kind of feeling like, do I even count now? You know, what counts as working class, I guess. But yeah, it can be, I think it can be a sense of difference. I don't know if anybody else has had that experience.
I suppose it depends on, I think, the point that Will was making at the start around how we define working class as well. Like, I'm sure the four of us would probably on some scale be regarded as middle class now, based on sort of education and salary and sort of, what's the word I'm looking for, sort of status as well, I guess. And I suppose it would be really easy to move into that quite comfortably, because it is quite comfortable, and sort of forget about stuff from your past. But it's something that I think amongst us we're quite proud of, and I guess it's how you hold on to that, and if it's something that you want to hold on to as well. And I know for me, I do.
Yeah. For me, I think one of the big sort of points of reflection for me was there was a Guardian article out maybe a year or two ago, and it was one of the, you don't see much written about this as a topic, I don't think, but it was a piece about an academic. I don't think she was a psychologist, but she was an academic of some sort. But they were talking about how she'd come from this very working class roots and then gone down the academic route and was now very kind of widely regarded in her field. And the way that they were talking about this, that like the narrative, it's interesting you were talking about narratives and stories before, Emma, because the narrative was that she'd come out of this really horrible experience, this really horrible deprived environment, and is now fine, right? It's like a success story, a Cinderella story almost, right? And it's like, God, how derogatory is that? How horrible is that that's the story? Yeah. And then the other bit that really jumped out at me, like it wasn't a bad article by any stretch, I'm not slagging it off, but the other bit that really jumped out at me was they were talking about one of the reasons why this person did well is, well, you know, her father was, you know, had a working class kind of background, did whatever job he did, but he was very well read. He would read the broadsheets, he would read this, he would read this. And again, I was really struck by that. And it's like, well, so hang on, it's only all right to be working class as long as you do things that are a bit middle class as well. Like, what's wrong with just not reading the book? Like, why is it almost like seen as this aspirational thing that everybody's striving to be in the middle class? Like, my family aren't. My family quite happy with the back of it. You know, my dad probably never read a broadsheet in his life and probably never will. Like, you know, it's just not that strivingness isn't there in the community I grew up in. So I think we've got to watch it, and this touches on, I think, the point that Kerry's raised about unconscious bias, because I think we have a bit of a responsibility to challenge a bit of that narrative as well. Sometimes when we spot things like that are actually quite derogatory and quite critical and quite unhelpful narratives, I think we've got a place to call that out.
I wonder though if that is still difficult, because there probably is an element of that residual, like, do you belong here? Like, you know, who gets to call shit out? You know, like, and who has the platform to call things out, or to name stuff even? And I think so, because I'm still struck now by, you know, being in just different professional situations where sometimes I still feel like, God, this is a bit hairy, you know, and feeling maybe that lack of confidence creeping in sometimes, because I still, on a certain level, don't always feel like I have a place at the table, or I don't, you know, that I have been the one that has snuck in, and the imposter syndrome is for real. And I think that's still, I think it's like part of that lingering sense of, like, you know, the chip on the shoulder kind of, I don't know what the cat term would be, but, you know, whatever the reciprocal role is, if there's chip on the shoulder actually being, you know, something in me that is lacking, or something that in me that still needs to be dressed up or hidden, maybe. I've noticed that I've sworn an awful lot less than I usually would in this whole thing, and I was thinking about that, you know, like, because it's being recorded and stuff, I was thinking, like, okay, Ben, you can't just don't, you know, you need to be very professional. But and I don't think obviously you can swear all the time, but I think even that, you know, monitoring, like, who else would think that, like, monitoring your language and all that kind of stuff. And I am conscious of things like dress and how you dress up for different things, and I don't know, just I think it still feels like a bit of a learning curve in lots of different ways, where maybe for other people it's not as much, because it's their space. Yeah,
I'd agree with
I see what you mean, Ben. Like almost like more conscious decision making about what are my boundaries here? What do I want to adapt to, and what do I not want to adapt to? And and how do I want to be with my family? And I certainly, I mean, I don't know about other people. Maybe it creates some division, but I found it helpful just to not talk to my family about my work. I just don't. Just because inevitably it just feels like starting to be a bit either mansplain. Sorry, I'll take that back. Not mansplaining. Like maybe just a little bit patronising or a bit. It just doesn't feel good. So I'd rather just play cards and talk about Coronation Street and have a cup of tea, and that's fine. And that's probably good for me too. You know, I think there's a danger in telling a negative narrative about that. Not at all. I think I go home and I feel the relief of no expectation, like you said, the non-scribey space of just being happy, and it's good.
Yeah. I think it's Megan who's raised a point as well about sort of potential tensions in family and friends as you've moved up. And similarly, my family, they try to understand what it is that I'm doing and why I moved away from the Northeast and how dare I do that type of thing. But I sometimes find the conversations difficult to have as well. One of the reasons my undergrad was so difficult is my dad had quite a catastrophic stroke when I was doing my undergrad, and I think sometimes it would be difficult for me to have the conversations with him about the work I do because of the experiences he's had. And when I worked as a nursing assistant, I would go to work in my nursing uniform. And I don't think he's ever gotten that image out of his head. So I think he's convinced I'm still a nurse, to be honest. And I'm quite comfortable with that. He knows I work for the NHS doing something nurse related potentially. But I'm okay with them not really getting it. It does give you a bit of relief when you go home and visit and things, and you're not talking about psychology and all that kind of stuff all the time, because I'm sure it gets dry at some point for people who aren't involved. But I can't say I've noticed any tensions. I think it was frustrating at times when I was trying to progress and people didn't understand my frustrations maybe as much. But I think that was my own thing rather than theirs.
Yeah, there's definitely something about your own frustration, for want of a better word. Like I vividly remember before I got on training, I'd got a paper published, and I worked my backside off getting that paper published. You know, I'd done loads and loads of voluntary data entry. We'd spent hours and hours and hours punching in numbers off questionnaires, all to get a publication to go on the CV. You know, really done loads and loads and loads. So it was such a massive achievement to get a paper published in a journal, you know, that had my name on it. And I remember telling my parents, and the response was literally, "What's a journal? So is that like a magazine?" Like they just had no awareness of what an academic journal was, and how could they? That, you know, my dad's an electrician. Like how could he have ever known what an academic journal was? So it just felt really almost dismissive, and I remember being really upset and angry about that at my parents. And it's only like further down the line as kind of time moves on, you think that it was an understandable reaction, but it wasn't a fair reaction. It wasn't fair of me to get annoyed at them for something they didn't know anything about, they didn't place any value on it because they didn't understand it. So it's kind of, I think for me, it's been a bit of a journey of acceptance and being all right with the worlds being quite separate. You know, my family life and my work life are different, and that's okay. That's not a bad thing. That's actually really, in a lot of ways, a positive thing.
I'll just counter that with a wee example. So whenever I finished my thesis and everything, and it was like ready to go, and I had to upload it into like the repository thing, the library thing, my dad thought that was like, he was like, "Oh my god, so this is online and like people will read it like a book." So I thought that was amazing, like overjoyed. And you know, I thought it was amazing too, but that was nice, you know, that kind of like, this was quite a small kind of pain in the arse step that you had to be formatted and all this bullshit. But actually just that thing of let's like sitting at home and finding it and uploading it and everything was such a lovely experience, you know, because it felt like, oh, there's a wee bit of recognition for all this kind of slog, and in a very unexpected way as well. You know, it was just like, what's that? I know that it's just uploaded into some database somewhere. It's not like amazing, but it was nice to have that wee moment. Which is quite nice.
Yeah, I had that moment, I think, when I finished training, when I qualified, because my mum could say to her friends, "Oh, Will's a doctor now," and I obviously had to step in and be like, "No, not that kind of doctor, not that. No, don't show me your rash or anything." That, it almost didn't matter because it was just a concrete thing that they understood and they got.
Yeah.
Something that I'd be interested in other people's perspectives on. Something in the chat was about role models, about is there a sense that we leave our communities and then leave them bereft of role models? Not sure what I think about that, but I am certainly mindful of children in my family now. Like my sister's children, my nieces and nephews are thinking, what do I want to bring to it? I certainly don't necessarily want to bring a narrative that Auntie Em is doing better than everybody else now, and this is what you should be aiming for. But maybe thinking about, I've not fully formed in my own head yet, but the ideas of giving them windows onto other experiences, maybe just giving them knowledge of other ways of living that are available that I certainly didn't know were there. I don't know if anyone else has any feelings about that.
I struggle sometimes with this rule because I think I would love to do that. I'd love this. Sometimes I think about the idea of going back to the community that I grew up in and whether working there or whatever, and striving to be some sort of like, it's a bit egotistical sometimes. I think a bit narcissistic to think that I would be a role model, but just to show that it is possible, because I never thought it was possible, and I think that multiple times throughout the journey I definitely didn't think it was possible. But I think with this type of job, it's a very difficult thing to like demonstrate. It's not a tangible thing that you like. Even if someone's in distress, you don't walk up and like magically just like do something and it's gone. It's it's more art than science sometimes, and that is a very difficult thing I think to communicate just generally. And I think particularly with families and stuff, it's very difficult to. So I wonder, like, there's a risk there that you get pulled into a lot of like performative psychologizing of different things because you want to be seen as like this magical, I don't know, like do-gooder who like minces in and fixes everyone's problems. But it just doesn't work like that, and I think that's the struggle for me sometimes. Is like, what are the, like Will was saying about having the doctor title? Yes, that's something you can absolutely hang stuff on. And my gran can now say like, oh, I'm making Ben, the doctor, a bacon sandwich or whatever, that's great. But actually, what could I tangibly show her that I do? And sometimes I come up against that still, and I'm like, shit, I actually don't know. Other than really giving her some really long-winded explanation of it, which she would just not understand and not appreciate. So it's a tricky one. I think that's just down to the nature of the job rather than the background or thing. I don't know. It's strange.
Something that I've looked at, and I can't remember the name of the charity now, and it's really annoying because while I've been talking, I've been racking my brain trying to remember. But there's a charity where you can sign up essentially and go and do talks at schools to try and encourage children to consider certain career paths, and I've sort of loosely signed up to it, but that's when I think the imposter syndrome kicks in a little bit. Like, who am I to go and speak to children about why they should maybe think about a career in what I'm doing? But more specifically, I've thought about going back to the schools I went to, because I would have loved that, as a kid, someone coming in and talking to little Hannah about what it means to be a clinical psychologist and how you get there. And it's something I would like to pursue potentially, if the imposter syndrome ever wears off.
I don't know if it ever wears off, but I think you just carry it differently as time goes on. I think you just get used to it being there.
Yeah.
Right, I'm mindful of time. We've gone way over what we said we would. I suppose just to finish, I'll look at my panel. Is there any kind of last thoughts anybody wants to mention, or any final questions or comments from our virtual audience?
There's a question here from Natalie about being treated differently in services based on being working class, and I don't think so, I'll be honest. I've tended to get on quite well with the teams I've been in, and I've never, other than some sort of specific times when I think that was just different because I wasn't part of the teams necessarily. I don't think it's been a particular challenge. I don't know how I would deal with it if I did, to be honest. I don't know if anyone else has come across anything like that in the past.
I haven't within like professional teams, but definitely I think sometimes within like assistant groups, I've felt a little bit like, well, you know, you should not be here, and that hasn't been necessarily anything explicitly said, but it's been communicated in different ways. So I think like, you know, I don't know, it's definitely been something about like, you know, you don't have what we have. You're not like us. You shouldn't necessarily be back like feeling like a mindset or something. Feeling like that's that.
Sorry, somebody's mic. One of our mics has gone really noisy, and I don't know who it is. Is it me?
Not mine.
I don't know why. It's only just started doing it. Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to respond to that actually, because I think actually I've personally never experienced any specific, what I would call discrimination or anything that remotely would come close to that in relation to you know, being working class. And I think I wouldn't want anyone to be put off applying for clinical psychology based on some of the challenges we've raised tonight. I think if anything, the fact that we're able to go in and almost fly the flag and raise these issues in the right way, and you know, for people like Hannah and Emma to go into placements currently, build good relationships with folk, talk about these things openly, you know, do good stuff. That's how we move things forward, isn't it? I think that's how we improve things. So yeah, I hope that feels like a useful response. Right, I'm going to attempt to draw this to a close. Firstly, thank you so much to everyone who's come along and stuck with us. Sorry we ran over a bit. That's bad planning on my part. I'll host the video online as soon as I get 5 minutes spare, and we'll tweet the link, so just follow me on Twitter, and I'll send it around in an email as well. What I'm also going to do is knock up a bit of like a survey, like a questionnaire, because I think we really want to get people's ideas for what you want from future things like this. We've got more planned, and again, I'll be tweeting details about that. So basically the idea is to have a different panel every time, and to have different trainees and qualified psychologists just coming in and doing exactly like what we've done tonight. So I'll send a survey around. Your feedback would be really appreciated in guiding what would be helpful for future events, really. Beyond all that, make some noise about it, tweet about it, use that hashtag that I mentioned before, you know, share with friends, colleagues, share the recording if that's useful, and let's try and get these conversations a bit more widely. Thank you so much to my fantastic panel, to Ben, Emma and Hannah, for your openness and honesty and humility. Thank you so much for giving up your Tuesday evening. You missed all the sunshine there because it's going dark. Well, thank you very much. And thanks to everyone in the audience for chipping in with just really thoughtful comments and questions. It's very much appreciated. Thank you for being nice and warm and welcoming to us. Made it a lot more pleasant an experience, so a lot less anxiety working. So thank you. Right, I'll leave it there. Thank you, everyone. See you again next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.